Okay, we are live. Joining to me today is a very special guest, all the way from, I'm assuming, Paris, Matthias, Michel. So for those who don't know you, Matthias, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, I'm a PhD student at Sorbonne University in Paris, and so I'm doing my PhD in philosophy of science, not philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, on the detection of consciousness in the neuroscience of consciousness. So I'm working on the different detection procedures that are used by consciousness scientists. So it's mostly to detect consciousness of contents, not states of consciousness, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I'll take that as a hostile comment, I guess. That's just not philosophy of mind. I'll ask you a little bit about that in a bit. But I like, because your work is interesting, because not only is it kind of historically based, that you want to understand where this stuff comes from,
Yeah.
but also is very contemporary as well. So it's got I think, a good mix of looking back, but also trying to see where we are and where the field is going. You still haven't defended your dissertation, you say?
No, I'm going to defend in September.
Okay, wow, congratulations.
I'm almost a doctor.
You're almost a quasi-doctor.
Yeah, quasi-doctor.
Cool, well, congratulations. Yeah, your work is excellent. How did you get interested in consciousness generally? Like, were you interested in before grad school?
Yeah, I was interested in consciousness before grad school. During my third year, so basically my first and almost only class in analytic philosophy, when I was in the licence, so it's the 3 first years here in France. My first class was in philosophy of mind, and so we studied consciousness a lot, obviously. And so at some point I thought that analytic philosophy was only philosophy of mind and philosophy of mind. Because obviously in France we don't have a lot of analytic philosophy. So yeah, studying consciousness was kind of obvious for someone doing analytic philosophy, I guess.
And so how does, because you have a very philosophy of science orientation, I would say, which I think is nice, as your opening comment suggested, right? But so if your exposure to it was in the philosophy of mind, then how did you gravitate towards the more philosophy of science approach?
So I did an MA in philosophy of science in Paris. And so I got interested in philosophy of science at that time, thinking more and more about like classical topics in philosophy of science. And also I read Liz Irvine's book.
Yeah, that's a great book, by the way. Yeah,
as a scientific concept, and I must say that it really changed a lot of things about the way I thought about consciousness science at that time, and I kind of realized that I was more interested in the ways in which scientists try to study consciousness than in the classical debates in philosophy of mind. And so I started to take this kind of philosophy of science approach to consciousness science.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, because her book is I think it's the first example that I know of in the contemporary literature of someone trying to really take consciousness seriously as a scientific concept. Like, what are they doing? How are they studying it? What methodological tools can we use? So
exactly.
that I was going to ask you about that. So I'm glad that you said that. So that's interesting. So when one of the kind of lessons I think that we can take from some of your work is this, there's a kind of myth in the science of consciousness that it began in the 90s. And a lot of your work, or not a lot of it, but I think some portion of your work is aimed at, or not, well, I don't know if that's, well, anyway. Would you think it's fair if someone said some portion of your work is aimed at trying to show that really there's a longer history, and that in fact, it's more than just a longer history. We see a kind of similar pattern repeating through the history.
Yeah, exactly. It's a kind of eternal return to consciousness and thinking that they're the first to study it.
Exactly. Yeah, that's an interesting phenomenon.
So there is a kind of pattern. I would love to do to take several quotes, all saying, well, since 15 years now, we've been studying consciousness and X, and it's not working.
Yeah, exactly. It's time to give up.
If you read people from, like, if you read Tim Challis, for example, in the 60s and 70s, I think there is an article by Tim Challis in the 70s in which he says, well, now we've been studying consciousness since 15 years, since basically the end of, the beginning of the end of behaviorism. And yeah, people have basically always been studying consciousness. Obviously, during behaviorism, it wasn't so important, at least in psychology. For example, if you take people in epileptology, studying epileptic seizures, for example, they have always been studying consciousness, because consciousness is part of the taxonomy of epileptic seizures. So it's basically what distinguishes what they call petit mal seizures and grand mal seizures. Yeah. And just today, before we began, I received this. So this is the Miller Psychology. This is one of the first textbook of cognitive psychology, and there are, I think, three chapters on consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. Sort of before the 90s, you might think.
It's in 1962, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it goes back even further, right? I mean, so if you can't help but notice at the beginning of psychology that it was defined as the science of mind and consciousness, basically. That's what they thought they were doing. And you know, I think you can exaggerate like certain early schools in psychological science, like, you know, the introspectionists and versus the functionalists or whatever, that like it's presented in the textbooks, basically. But whatever the case was, when you read like Tishner or any of those guys, what they're interested in are like, you know, the units that build up the mind, and it's talking about consciousness, and there's a debate we would say is like structuralism versus atomism or something, but it's all about consciousness.
Yeah. And well, even a lot of people say that what really began in the 90s was the search for the neural correlates of consciousness. But for example, if you look at the second half of the 19th century, you have a lot of people talking about the physical conditions of consciousness. So, for example, in 1887, there is a book by Henry Moseley called The Physical Conditions of Consciousness. In 1887. In 1886, there is a book by Alexandre Hersen. I don't know if it's translated in English, but anyway, you have a lot of people studying consciousness at that time, and they're all studying. I think there is even a book by Thomas Laycock that is entitled "The Neural Correlates of Consciousness," the physical correlates of consciousness.
Wow, the physical correlates of consciousness.
Yeah, a lot of people are actually trying to know what in the physical, in the nervous system is differentiating between conscious states and unconscious states, and people have been doing that for a very long time now.
Right, and I mean, I think so I was peripherally aware of this already, because just by reading Huxley's famous article on the, you know, hypothesis that animals are automata, or whatever it's actually called, and he talks about the famous frog experiments, and he even talks about the hypothesis that consciousness is located in the spinal cord, and it's like very similar to the overflow debates, and that. So I wasn't aware of the extent. So I was sort of aware that there was this issue back then in the late 1800s. But after reading your work, I became aware of just like how generally pervasive the issue was, and that it actually was like a main topic of discussion at the time.
Yeah, exactly. And some of the most important scientists at the time studied this. I mean, it's not a kind of fringe topic, right?
Yeah. And so you think it really closely mirrors the current overflow debates.
Yeah.
So can you say a little bit about, first of all, what you think, that how you construe that debate, and whether you think that they really are having the same debate or a similar one?
Yeah, I think it's basically the same debate. So a good way to start is to talk about the distinction between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, of course. So that's in contemporary terms, right?
Yeah.
The stuff, the conscious stuff that you can access, and what there is some contents that there is something it's like to have those mental states, but you cannot access it. And so you cannot report being conscious of some things. So during the second half of the 19th century, this distinction became really important. And so Thomas Laycock, for example, in 1879, has a book in which he distinguishes consciousness as feeling and consciousness as knowledge. And so you have a lot of debates about how many items can you be conscious of at once, for example. And so if you look at the lessons of metaphysics by Hamilton, there is this debate. And for example, Charles Bonnet thought that you can see only 5 or 6 items, and others thought that you can see more items than that. And at some point, Thomas Laycock has this quote where he says, well, but they're missing the point. The point is not how many objects you think you see, it's how many objects you're conscious of at once. You're conscious in the sense of consciousness as feeling. And so it's basically the same debate as the debate we have today. And in a sense, this is a debate that is even older than that. I often consider that Condillac is the first overflow theorist. So I think it's in 1740s, he has the essay on the origins of human knowledge. And in this, he argues that the fact that he argues that there are 2 kinds of conscious contents, basically conscious mental states. You have some conscious mental states that are so subtle that you forget them immediately, and there are some stronger conscious states that you remember. And he makes this distinction, and a lot of people were influenced by that. And so, for example, you have George Henry Lewis, who was one of the first proponents of the what I call the overflow view, but it's obviously not really the exact same thing. It's kind of really similar, but he writes that obliviscence, the fact that you forget something, is not a proof that you didn't feel it in the first place.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So the idea is that you consciously experience it, but then it just disappears really quickly, so you forget it.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so can I just ask you really quickly? So the sense when they say consciousness as feeling, which I'm happy with that as being a kind of stand-in for phenomenal consciousness. That's all right with me if that's what I take you to be saying. And then the consciousness as knowledge is the access consciousness part in the 19th century, distinction. And it's clear from their writing that they're using feeling here to characterize visual sensations. So there's a feeling of red, which sounds a bit weird in normal English, I guess.
I think it's really, really, really clear. Yeah.
And then when they talk about the consciousness as knowledge, it's knowledge of what you're feeling, or knowledge of something in the external environment, or is that distinction?
I really think it's similar to noticing. So if you have consciousness as knowledge, it's that you notice that you have some conscious mental states. So it's basically really similar to the concept of a-perception.
Right.
You perceive some stuff, but you also a-perceive it, in the sense that you somehow perceive yourself perceiving it.
And so you think that the right way to characterize this debate is that one camp really thought that you could have feeling without being aware in any sense that you had that feeling, whereas the other side was saying that the way I read Huxley is certainly saying, without the awareness of the feeling, then there is no feeling, like in the severed spinal cord case, which is one of the big cases they talked about, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so a lot of this was because of the frogs, what they did to these poor frogs.
There were other, so there are two big debates, the debate about subliminal perception, and obviously the distinction between consciousness as feelings and consciousness as knowledge plays a big part, because a lot of people will say, well, it's not that you have subliminal perception, it's just that you forget some perceptions immediately,
Right.
and you remember some other perceptions. And so you have, on the one hand, this debate, and on the other hand, the debate about the physiological conditions of consciousness. Yeah.
And so in this late 19th century, there's like basically three camps, I think, right? It's what you argue. The one was that there's consciousness in the spinal cord, another that it's in the brain, but maybe at what we would consider a first order level, like some kind of representation of the environment. And then maybe the third that it requires the knowledge or awareness of having or the noticing or whatever. So there's each one of those camps, and the same as we have today, except one actually, which is what I was going to ask about. But do you think we have analogs of each of those camps?
Yeah, exactly. So maybe you can explain one. So there are many cases of, they basically tried to do everything with decapitated frogs. So, the decapitated frog case comes from, I think the original one comes from Pflüger in 1853. And so my favorite of these cases is a case in which a frog is dropped in water and it is submerged. And even if the frog is decapitated, it will swim to the surface. But now, imagine that you put an inverted jar in the path of the frog as it tries to swim to the surface. Even if it's decapitated, it will just try to go to the surface, realize that it cannot go to the surface, and just swim out of the jar to the surface.
And this is without a brain. There's no head, there's no brain.
Without a head. And so I think it's right to be really amazed by that. And so here you really see the debate about, well, but should we take the flexible behavior of the frog as an indication of consciousness? And so that was one of the arguments that people who thought that there is consciousness in the spinal cord, like Lewis and many others. Pflüger also thought that, Foster and Schiff, for example. All these people were literally taking the fact that there is flexible behavior as an indication of consciousness, while other people thought, well, this just shows that you can have unconscious flexible behavior.
Right.
It's kind of modus ponens, modus tollens thing, right?
Yes, exactly.
So
and the debate is whether really that kind of behavior by itself is sufficient to conclude that normally what we think causes it, namely the conscious experience, is playing the same role there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So now, I mean, just to jump quickly to what I think the upshot of all this is, you think that ultimately, so we have this old debate, which very similar parallels, and you might quibble with, well, is that really access consciousness? And because the way it's defined as, guiding behavior, not just knowledge. All right, so maybe not, but either way, it's very similar. Like, I think it's hard to deny that they're basically talking about the same thing. And so it doesn't get resolved, really. And then people forget about it, and now it's back again, and we're still arguing about this. And so I think the lesson that you want to conclude from this is that there's just not really a good way to empirically settle this issue, which is why it keeps popping back up.
I wouldn't be so pessimistic.
Okay. Oh, that's good. Okay, because I thought you were that pessimistic.
I'm extremely optimistic about consciousness science, if it's done in the right way.
Right.
So the issue is, about underdetermination. So the idea is that basically in consciousness science, and that's what I think this debate really shows. I mean, the fact that the debate keeps coming back really shows that the issue is somehow underdetermined, in the sense that every time you have a counter-argument to a specific theory of consciousness, for example, someone can come and just say, well, I deny that this entity is conscious, or, well, you don't think this entity is conscious, but it's really conscious. For example, a good case is the integrated information theory and the inactive logic gates.
Yes.
So Aronson comes and says, well, according to your theory, inactive logic gates are conscious. And so they just bite the bullet and say, well, that's because you think that you presuppose that not having any interesting behavior or performing any interesting function could be taken as an indication of consciousness, but we don't think so. We reject this premise, and so we accept that inactive logic gates are conscious. And so each time it's always possible to reject the indication that you used as indicating, that you interpreted as indicating consciousness. And so since you can pretty much always do that, it's really difficult to find counterexamples and to really test theories of consciousness. That's why that's a real problem, I think. But I think there's also some ways of trying to solve this problem. And that's what I'm trying to do now.
Okay, so that's the optimism part.
Yeah.
And these ways, I assume, are ways that are going to be new, since this has been going on for a couple hundred years, or depending on who you talk to, maybe a few 400 or 500 years. You want to go back to Leibniz and those guys, which I think could be, as you construe it, a similar debate there between Leibniz and Descartes, right? So yeah, it's kind of an issue that's been around the block. So hopefully these new techniques are going to be powerful. But before getting to those, and if you want to talk about, I don't know if you want to reveal what you're working on or not, but if so, I would be interested. But before doing that, let me just ask about the kind of the reason for being pessimistic. So do you don't think, let me preface my asking by pre-asking a different question. Do you think there's been no progress at all in this endeavor, in this particular case?
If it's in this particular case, I think there's been enormous progress. But there's a difference between making a lot of progress and people recognizing that a lot of progress has been made.
Right, okay.
So it's always possible for some people to just deny that progress has been made. But I think that's really a lot of progress has been made. For example, on the neural correlates of consciousness, I think that fMRI was a kind of revolution. Well, I think on consciousness in general, we know much more than we did even 30 years ago, I think. For example, take just the relation between attention and consciousness. The fact that, the experiments by Bob Kendridge showing that, well, maybe attention is not sufficient for consciousness, at least. That's something we probably didn't know before.
Well, I mean, to illustrate your point, though, I mean, like, people object to that as really showing that. So certainly, Jesse Prinz has a whole interpretation of that involving orienting as opposed to attention and blah, 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 and diffused attention, and et cetera. So there's always a way of reinterpreting or trying to reevaluate the evidence, which you might, and I know you addressed this, but you might just think that's a general feature of theorizing. And so, I mean, I wonder if you would, so just generally from a philosophy of science point, is it fair to say that one thing that you may draw from your work is that theory advancement really sometimes depends on non-empirical considerations, like non-theoretical considerations.
Well, that's the point of the underdetermination argument.
Right. Okay. Good.
If theory choice basically is underdetermined by the evidence, then you to make the choice to choose your theory, you need something else than empirical evidence, and most of the time it depends on epistemic values. So it's not really a problem. But in consciousness science, I mean, there are cases in which it depends on maybe non-epistemic values like authority, stuff like that.
But I mean, why isn't that just a sort of case in general, right? So I know you have this paper with Haquan where you're talking about these sociological factors, and especially with respect to the hard problem, or the meta problem of why are we talking about a hard problem, or why is there a hard problem? No, just kidding. But anyway, so I know that you guys talk about these sociological factors, and in consciousness science there are definitely those factors at play, but it's the same in quantum foundations of quantum theory. It's the same in, well, Chomsky linguistics. I mean, why is this not just a general feature as opposed to like a persistent problem for consciousness science?
The problem with consciousness science is that basically in situations in which a field is underdetermined by the evidence, there are, entire fields don't remain underdetermined for such long times, usually. But here it's a special case.
Oh wait, so I don't want to interrupt you, but just to interrupt you, for clarification, you don't think that it's a general feature? I mean, underdetermination is a general feature.
Yeah, I think it's a general feature of science, but theories just don't remain underdetermined for 300 years, right? It's not supposed to last that long.
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess I thought the underdetermination argument is supposed to be like, in principle, all empirical theories are underdetermined.
Oh, no.
Not just like some of them, but like, that's just like, there's always an equivalent theory that you can formulate. I mean, certainly string theory is teaching us about, in terms of dualities, that, there are certain equivalent theories with different ontologies. And so when does a theory not become underdetermined? When does it get determined?
Well, I think it becomes determined when it becomes too costly to reject some hypothesis. And that's why I think that's the main issue for consciousness science.
Yes, but the cost function there is not defined in terms of theoretical principle or data. It's defined in terms of something else, right?
Sorry?
So the cost, what determines whether it's costly to do that, is not something that's theoretical or data driven, but something that's sociological or epistemic.
Yeah, sometimes it's sociological, sometimes it's also theoretical. For example, if to save your hypothesis, you need to reject some principle that is also used in other fields of science. Let's imagine that to save your hypothesis, you need to reject, I don't know, some basic principle of perception science. Then it's really costly to reject, to save your hypothesis, sorry. So it's not just sociological, it's also scientific. If you have some principle that you need to reject in order to save your hypothesis, there are cheap and costly principles to reject. And with the progress of neuroscience, I think that more and more principles will become more and more costly to reject. And also, from the more sociological perspective, I think that some principles can be made somehow more costly to reject because they play a role, for example, in law, in the attribution of moral responsibility,
Right.
for example, in therapies, and so on and so on. And so, because people care about these principles, they become more costly to reject.
Right. Okay. So I understand what you're saying, but I still think that in some sense, the theories are underdetermined by the data.
Yeah.
Because it's these extra data things that are determining the cost of rejecting or something like that. So if you like the Quinean or Duhem or whatever kind of picture, is that the rejecting principles more towards the center of the structural support layers of the web. That's what the cost. That's where the cost comes.
Yeah, in a sense, exactly.
Okay. All right. So I can.
Yeah, it's in the center of science in general.
Yes, that would be very bad. But I mean, so this, there are times when that doesn't happen, but still. So, you know, I don't know, the famous case of water and H2O. I don't know if you probably are, but do you know the work of Hasok Chang? Do you know who Hasok? He has this wonderful book, which I love, and I wish everyone read more, is Water H2O. His other book is great too, The Untitled Chapter. He has a lot of good stuff. Anyway, so in this book, he really tells, like, you know, so there's this story about they did this famous experiment. They took water and they got the two things, and there's oxygen here and hydrogen there. And okay, so doesn't that sort of conclusively suggest or very strongly suggest that these two separate things are what compose water? And the historical answer is, of course, well, there are a lot of people that argue to the contrary, actually. And people said, no, it's interaction of electricity with the water that creates these new things. And so there was no like deciding moment when they decided water is H2O. It's just like people, you know, it's kind of useful and that other stuff wasn't. And they just phlogiston was kind of, but there's nothing that like truly falsified phlogiston theory, really.
Yeah, exactly. And Hasok Chang even defends in this book, if I remember correctly, that they actually rejected phlogiston theory a bit too early.
Yeah, exactly. Right, exactly.
Reasons for rejecting it.
Well, right, exactly, because he argues that they had to like reinvent those same notions, but they had to wait for like electrons and stuff like
that. Yeah. But I mean, in this case, of course, it was somehow underdetermined by the evidence, but it didn't last for such a long time, I think. In consciousness science, it's a bit worrying, precisely because it's really a kind of lasting underdetermination.
So you're right. There may have been 70 years or something like that when the people were like, this may be wrong, but then eventually they kind of just died down. It just died down, and people adopted the water as H2O.
I think it will be the same in consciousness science, actually.
Yeah, eventually it's. I mean, so that's part of what I was trying to get at here is that so the debate has progressed in some sense. So I think your earlier answer was about like, has science of consciousness progressed? Whereas I was asking, have we made any progress on this overflow argument? Do we think we have any reasons to think one way or the other? And what I got from at least reading your article was that that you were kind of pessimistic that this was going to keep popping up. But one kind of reason I thought for optimism was that we don't talk about the spinal cord anymore. There's not very many defenders of consciousness and spinal cord. Now there's a lot of debate about, but it's all about, you know, it may be embodied, and maybe that's the spinal cord stuff coming back.
Well, I mean, we have worse than consciousness and spinal cord, to my
yeah, exactly.
Panpsychism is, or if you take IIT to be quasi-panpsychist on the strong interpretation of IIT, then I think it's worse. I mean, it's even less intuitive than consciousness in the spinal cord. So,
well, I mean, to be fair, a lot of those early 18th, 19th century guys were panpsychists too. I mean,
exactly.
Tishner was a panpsychist, as far as I know, and so panpsychism was dual, or some kind of dual aspect, or something like that was a very popular view. So I'm not sure why isn't that a separate issue though, really? Because if one of the questions is like about the physical conditions, which we're taking as kind of talk about correlates, then it's a kind of a different question to say whether it's panpsychist or materialist or what, right?
I guess if you're a panpsychist, you are committed to the view that you can have phenomenal consciousness without any kind of cognitive functions, or without access consciousness, and so it's related to the overflow. It's a kind of extreme extreme overflow view in a sense.
It's the ultimate overflow, exactly. Yeah. It is interesting. I mean, I don't want to too much about panpsychism, but it is interesting to note that some of these panpsychists, like maybe Galen Strawson, for example, don't deny that you need some kind of awareness, though, right? So that he thinks wherever there's a conscious experience, there's also kind of a self having that experience, someone that it's for. So in a sense, it's I don't know. So however, depending on how you cast that out, I'm not really even sure that you can make sense of the overflow view. I mean, that was something I was going to ask you about, is that there's this long history of people having this debate. And to me, I mean, when I've started working on this stuff, to be honest, I have to admit that when I was young, I thought, yeah, there's something to the overflow debate. And I was kind of convinced by the common sense examples of the jackhammer in the background, suddenly becoming aware of it. And then the more I thought about it, the more I just didn't really understand what it even means conceptually for there to be an experience, which is like my experience, that it's for me, but which I just don't have any awareness of. So do you think that part of the argument in this earlier debate involved like this kind of understanding of the conceptual nature of it, or was it empirically based? Was the coherency of the concept of consciousness without access questioned at all in this earlier debate?
Yeah, I think it was questioned. It was not only empirical. I know that it was questioned. For example, Bastien. By the way, it's in 1869, so it's the first in the first volume of the journal Nature. An article by Charlton Bastien, and he's talking about, so in the first volume of Nature, there is an article about overflow. But, so he defends the view that it's basically there are some principled objections to the idea of overflow. I don't think his arguments are really good, actually, but yeah, there was a kind of philosophical debate about that. And there is the physiological debate, the debate about the physiology of consciousness. Obviously, if there is consciousness in the spinal cord, then it's a kind of consciousness that is not accessed.
Right.
So it means that you can use the physiological debate to solve the debate about basically the overflow debate.
I mean, it's not even clear that that's really the right way of thinking about the options, because if there is consciousness in the spinal cord, and if it's severed, then I know one of the views that was around was, maybe that there are two consciousnesses now.
Yeah.
And so maybe there's like no access of this one to the spinal cord consciousness, but that's like me not having access to your consciousness, which is no big deal. But maybe the spinal cord consciousness has access to its spinal cord consciousness. And so I don't even think that really that even if they thought there was spinal cord consciousness, that all by itself is any evidence for their view.
Yeah, actually, yeah. Well, if you had enough ad hoc hypothesis,
Yeah, exactly.
you can save that view.
Exactly.
That's the problem, right? Yeah, then it's really difficult to see how, because in a sense we don't really have. I mean, here is the way I think about it now. I think the burden of proof should be on people who think that consciousness overflows access, and I don't think they can bring any evidence that is going to be that is going to force anyone to accept this idea, because every time, I mean, it would be my bet that every time they bring some evidence, it will be possible to explain it without postulating overflowing contents or some stuff that you are conscious of that you can't access.
So that I like that first point you made. And I know I've talked with Ned, who's a overflow guy currently, Ned Block, and he disputes that pretty vigorously, and he gets kind of angry in a philosophical way, not in a real angry. But you know what I mean. He gets kind of flustered when people say that the burden of proof is on the overflow people. And actually, he has complained that seems unfair to him, that he thinks the burden of the proof should be the other way. So just out of curiosity, how would you address that claim? Why do you think the burden of proof is on the overflow side?
Yeah. So there are two reasons why. The first reason is that that's not how people use the concept consciousness. Well, in fact, there are three reasons.
Aha.
The first reason is that that's not how people use the concept consciousness. If you are assessing the moral responsibility of someone, and you ask, well, was the person conscious of what she was doing, for example? You're not asking whether she had inaccessible sensations. You're asking whether she could control her actions, whether she could, she had a kind of access to what she was doing. So that's the first way of putting the issue. So I would take the principle that if you use a term in a way that doesn't go, that is somehow incoherent with the way in which people typically use it, the burden of proof is on you to show me that I should accept to use the word as you use it. For example, if you think that, I don't know, supernovas are furnitures, if you classify the sun as furniture, you have to bring me a good reason for doing that, right? I don't have to bring you reasons for not considering volcanoes as furnitures. Okay. So that's the first point. The second point is that it's a kind, so it's what Hazop Cheng calls a semantic extension. So it's a case in which we don't have any indication that we could use to detect the entity we are postulating. Right now, there is absolutely no way of detecting of detecting overflowing phenomenal consciousness. There is just no way to detect this stuff. I'm pretty sure about that. And so if you think that it exists, you better have really good reasons for making us make all those efforts to try to discover this stuff, right? And the third reason is that I think phenomenal consciousness, overflowing phenomenal consciousness, is completely useless for therapeutic purposes. So imagine that to cure phobias, for example, I can expose you to stimuli unconsciously, okay? And I flash you pictures of spiders that are masked, and you do a kind of unconscious exposure therapy this way. And at the end of the therapy, if you didn't see any of the spiders, or at least you don't feel like you saw any of the spiders, and if indeed you are less afraid of the spiders after the therapy, I won't say, well, but you were conscious of the spiders all along. No, of course you were not conscious of the spiders, because if you had been conscious of the spiders, you would have freaked out, right? And so it's inconsistent with the way in which we would use the term consciousness to get effective therapeutic treatments, for example. So these are basically the three reasons why I think the burden of proof should be on those who defend overflow. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Can I ask about them quickly? So the first reason was we don't use the term that way. So I wonder how you would respond to Ned's claim, which is contestable, but I'd like to hear how you contest it. So in cases like the Sperling experiments, where people are presented with these arrays of letters, and they're very brief, and so and I do this in my class too. I show students these things because it's fun to see their reaction. But so the letters pop up for a quick amount of time, you barely see them, and then allegedly, although we don't have a lot of evidence for this, but allegedly people report that they feel like they saw all the letters, even though they can't say what they are. So they fail at reporting them. So Ned interprets that as a kind of common sense overflow claim. And so you want to say that's not, or it seems like you would have to.
You have to, you need to assume that the best explanation of this phenomenon is that there is phenomenal overflow in order to take it as meaning that people accept the overflow sense. But
well, why can't you just take it like that? People are saying, "Gee, I felt like I saw more than I can say," which is, I mean, it seems like a natural way, a thing to say that, you know, I see more than I can tell you right now. Just
so you are access conscious of the fact that you saw more than you can tell.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that there's a sense in which you, but that's kind of what Bloch's point, I think, is. And, you know, I'm not an overflow theorist, although I think there are days when I'm sort of sympathetic to something like that, to be honest with you, but because I think these questions are hard. But anyway, his claim is that what you're accessing in that kind of case is the general features, that there were a bunch of letters. So you have access conscious, excuse me, the access conscious part is telling you that you have access to more than you can say.
Yeah.
So that's not a weird thing to say on his view. That's kind of what the view is. It's just the details that are not accessed.
Yeah, but I just don't think you need more than that to account for people's feelings.
But maybe that's in the fullness of time, I understand what you mean. But all I was asking is, why isn't this a case of just, if someone says, "Gee, I felt like I saw more than I can tell you," why isn't the natural reading of that they saw more than they can report?
Because,
but before you theorize about anything, why isn't that a natural reading? I guess I'm asking.
Well, I mean, if you're going to interpret it with respect to consciousness, you need some kind of pre-theoretical or something. And I mean, as I take the overflow, it's a kind of scientific hypothesis, right? So here, thinking that saying this is a way of testifying of the fact that people think that consciousness overflows access and use the term in this way. I really think it presupposes that you think that their statements should be understood in terms of the overflow view. So it's kind of, I feel like it's a bit begging the question, actually.
Okay, so how would you, so if someone says, "I see more letters than I can tell you," how do you interpret what they're saying?
Well, they were conscious of a lot of letters, of seeing a lot of letters, and then they were they could report only a few letters. It doesn't imply any overflow. Maybe an explanation of this phenomenon, maybe a scientific explanation of this phenomenon would require us to postulate the existence of overflowing contents, but the normal interpretation of this phenomenon, the kind of folk interpretation, doesn't really require to suppose that there is such thing, I think.
So do you think that there's an interesting question here about what the folk really, how they would respond? Because, you know, I have tried to get some experimental philosophers to do this, actually, and I haven't done it yet. And I don't want to do experimental philosophy, but it does seem to me that I mean, I have thought that if they did these kind of Sperling experiments and then tried to get the quantitative data right, but then also just ask for qualitative data like this, you know, what is it like for you when you see these things? Because I do this informally in the class, and it seems to me like people are split. And after you talk, you show them a bunch and you do it for a while, and then you sort of ask like, okay, you know, what was it like? And were you aware of this or not, consciously or not? People split. Some people say, yeah, I saw all of them. It's just that I can't name them. Some people literally say stuff like that. And other people say, no, I just have this vague sense that there's a bunch of letters there. And so I do sort of feel, I wonder how, I mean, it doesn't seem obvious to me that the folk are settled on this question.
Well, I think that even if you do that, once again, the overflow issue is a scientific issue, and so any report from your students, say, could be interpreted either as indicating that
Oh, right. No, I agree about that.
Concept of consciousness includes overflow, or as not indicating that their concept of consciousness includes overflow. So
right.
I guess it's.
I was just trying to, no, I totally agree with that, and that's a fair point, but I was just trying to address your first burden of proof argument, which was that the burden is on the overflow people because the folk don't talk about overflow. So we would need some reason to even consider, or they would need to convince us to take that seriously. They, the overflow people, would need to convince us, because one reason being it's not part of the normal concept of consciousness. And I was just trying to say, well, okay, so here's what they would say, I think, in response. And then if your answer is, yeah, well, okay, so it depends on your background assumptions and interpretations, which one you actually go with, then it doesn't seem to me like the folk burden of proof thing counts for very much ultimately.
Oh, you think so? Because, I mean, the folk burden of proof is more that in situations in which using the term is important to us, and it's in the law, right? For moral responsibility, consciousness is basically in the law. In this case, it's clear that it's access consciousness. So in the cases in which we use the concept,
but that's because they're talking about behavior. So that's obviously what you want to appeal to, is access consciousness in that case. I mean, well, no one's guilty of having unaccessed thoughts that are criminal in nature or whatever, But anyway. But so that's different. I mean, so the law, so I guess what I'm, so yeah, I agree with you that in the law, maybe is codified a certain conception of consciousness that has to do with more access than phenomenal, in the way it's typically contrasted, although, I'm with you that they are related.
So now, if you accept that, using the term consciousness as involving overflow is incoherent with that?
With respect to that aspect of the legal part of it, yeah.
Okay.
So but I don't think that's the same as the folk.
Sorry?
I don't think that's the same as saying that the folk don't use it.
Okay, let's say that there are a bunch of uses of the term consciousness, at least, that are incoherent. And if you use the term in a way that is incoherent with how it is used in domains in which it is important to use the term, then perhaps the burden of proof is on you.
But I mean, I agree. That's a nice way of putting it. But so there may be other non-legal contexts where, consider anesthesia, surgery. So it might be important in that case if you're worried about suffering, if there were unaccessed phenomenal consciousness, like, so is that not, if you're really an IIT person, then I guess you have to worry about logic gates and how you treat them.
Would it be important if I can't notice my own pain? I would be in pain, but don't know that I'm in pain. At any moment, it would be a weird kind of pain, right? Phenomenal.
It would be a weird kind of pain.
So I'm not even sure people would accept to talk in this way about pain. But once again, maybe we should do experimental philosophy on this. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I wish someone would do it. That's not me. Yeah. So, and then the second, so I think, with those caveats, I think that's a good burden of proof claim. Then the second one, let's see, I forget. The third one was a therapy, which I think is going to be sort of similar to what we were just talking about. Because, unaccessed depression is probably just as bad as being depressed and knowing it. So you might want to treat that anyway, but you get the same sort of issue, right? Do people even talk that way?
The argument is a bit different.
Okay.
The argument is a bit different in the third case, because in the third case, the best explanation of the fact that we succeed at doing this stuff is because people were not conscious of the stimuli.
Oh, right. So right, because we're talking about the specific unconscious fear conditioning case. I forgot about that. Right. So, but there, it's not clear to me that really you couldn't give the kind of fleeting, forgotten kind of response. Yeah, maybe there was phenomenally experienced spiderness, and it's just, you know, since you don't access it, you don't have the knowledge of it. But you show all this, you know, your heart rate increases, all that sort of stuff. So there certainly is something being processed there. So it's
yeah, you can,
and you might even think that if it wasn't like the spideriness that you were aware of, then it wouldn't have the effect. So I don't know that that's not useful in some sense.
Maybe you can call that schmonsciousness. Define it as the kind of consciousness people don't really care about.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it is the kind of consciousness that they care about. It's just that they care about it more when they're aware of it. But
when they're aware of it, it's not,
I'm just playing the devil's advocate. Obviously, I don't agree with overflow, and you know, I think you know that I'm really,
yeah, you're biased.
I'm biased, yeah, exactly. But I'm trying to. I'm speaking as someone who thinks that before I started doing philosophy, I was an overflow theorist.
Yeah,
and I didn't know it because I think that I was a kind of common sense view. And then when I read about it, I was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. And then after thinking about it, I was led away from it, and now I would sort of reject it, I guess, on certain days in certain moods. But it doesn't seem to me like you have to really do a lot of work to get people to sort of go, yeah, okay, that seems like sometimes that's the case, you know. Whereas the other stuff, you have to get them. So, you know, to convince them that there are unconscious pains that are really pains, but not consciously experienced, that you have to do a lot of work to get people to accept, I think. Whereas this other thing, that there are conscious pains that you don't know about, is less hard to motivate from a common sense. So that to me suggests that one is more entrenched in common sense than the other. You know, I always give the example of when I was a child, my sister and I were walking on the beach, and she stepped on a bee. She didn't know she stepped on a bee. I saw her limping and said, "Why are you walking like that?" And she said, "Walking like what?" And she looked at her foot and then started screaming. And so because she saw the bee, and that's from a common sense point of view, it sort of seems like that's when it started hurting, right? When she became aware that there was this damage.
Mm-hmm.
But of course she was limping before that. So something was sensitive to the fact that there was that damage. Yeah. And that's, of course, the detection criterion that really is at the heart of all of the stuff we're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's so how, I mean, given where all of this stuff is, why? So what I think that you're trying to argue is that what makes this distinct is that in consciousness research, it's always easier to reject one of these, right? So that you can say, look, well, the limping doesn't go with consciousness because you weren't aware of it. Or you could say, oh, no. Reporting doesn't go with consciousness because you have consciousness without the reporting. And so you're never really going to get a cost like the way you do in these other areas.
Yeah, so basically the claim is that in consciousness science, no what I call detection rules, that you use some indication as that you interpret some event or some indication as indicating the presence or absence of consciousness. No detection rule is too big to fail, in a sense. So you can always reject indications as indicating consciousness. You can say, well, but this doesn't really indicate consciousness, or in fact, we should interpret this as indicating consciousness, stuff like that.
Right.
Always do that. And it's always cheap to do that, right? Because we disagree on what should count as the right indication of consciousness.
I mean, is it always cheap though? Because, you know, I know one of the cases you talk about is the anencephalic children that have these emotional responses. And I think that's a really great case because a lot of people want to say, look, you know, here they are, they're smiling at their mother's voice, and that's, you know, so they're experiencing some kind of emotion or sensation or something. And then the other side says, well, no, that's, you know, an innate triggered evolutionary response to the mother so they don't get killed, basically, because babies are annoying or something like that. I mean, no offense to babies, but so that it's not involving consciousness. But isn't that like, people really find that hard to take seriously? So isn't that a cost when you say, oh no, the baby smiling doesn't involve consciousness?
I mean, it can be a cost if we don't have really good evidence or good reasons to think that it can happen unconsciously. Aside from that, yeah.
Right. So exactly. So that's really the key here, is that once you open up the possibility that there's empirically good reason to think that these things can happen unconsciously, then you get this whole conundrum. And of course, that's why there's a certain side of the dispute out there that wants to deny the very existence of unconscious perception. You know, like I think Ian Phillips' work is, I don't know if he really is a true believer in this or not, but he certainly is exploring the possibility that maybe there is no unconscious perception.
Yeah.
And part of the motivation for that, I think, are some of these issues. So is that another underdetermined issue on your view?
No, I don't think so. I think that we can, so at least in humans, I think we can develop really good detection procedures. I think we can show why some detection procedures are better than others. So I disagree almost completely with Liz Irvine on these points.
Okay, good.
So that's pessimistic, and I defend the optimistic view that we have good reasons for preferring some detection procedures over others.
Can you tell us like a couple of these reasons?
Yeah, that's slightly, that would be slightly long. It's basically my PhD dissertation.
Dissertation. Is there any sort of like slogan or bullet form that could help a pessimistic person who wants to be optimistic?
Yeah. So first of all, it's really important to understand that what we judge as indications of consciousness in consciousness science are never individual reports. So one report doesn't indicate one conscious event.
Right.
Okay? And so often people say that, well, we can trust those reports, and the scientists are interpreting those reports as indicating consciousness, but they're wrong. No, they're not really doing that. What they are doing is interpreting a pattern of reports, given a pattern of behaviors on a task, as indicating consciousness or unconsciousness. So that's a big difference. So basically, you interpret a pattern of reports as indicating consciousness all along the task. So, or unconsciousness on some sets of stimuli during the task. But you're never considering one particular report. So then if you do that, you can use signal detection theory and try to, some tools borrowed from signal detection theory, and try to avoid biases. And so you can have unbiased detection procedures. People call it measures of consciousness, but we shouldn't call measures of consciousness, because to measure is to, I would like to restrict the term measurement for quantitative properties. I'm not sure consciousness is quantitative, so right now we can detect it, say if it's there or not. And so that's what what scientists basically do, is try to use bias-free procedures in order to detect consciousness. So in many, many cases, the issue of biases just doesn't really arise. The issue of, well, but we don't have really good reasons for thinking that subjective reports are true. But the truth of subjective reports is not a real question. Because in a sense, subjective reports are neither true nor false. It's like basically there is a kind of metaphor that people use. They interpret metaphorically subjective reports as sentences that a subject would say, I saw the stimulus. And of course, if you interpret it this way, it can be true or false. But the right way to interpret it is to interpret it as traces that are left by unconscious or conscious mental state. And a trace, in this sense, is neither true nor false. So subjective reports are like traces, and you use them, you gather them, and then you can decide on the basis of this whether subjects are conscious or unconscious of the stimuli during the task or during a set of trials during the task. So here you eliminate the issue of the veracity of subjective reports, because subjective reports are not true, they're not false either. You eliminate the issue of biases, and I could honestly go on and on about basically all the skeptical arguments against detection procedures in consciousness science. They really don't get off the ground, I think. Mostly they're based on a kind of series of misunderstanding of what scientists are actually doing with those procedures. And I think they apply to first-person sciences, in which people have to give long introspective reports. But in the kind of detection procedures that are used in consciousness science, I don't think it works.
Yeah, wow, that's interesting. So this is obviously related to heterophenomenology in some sense, to Dennis' view, right? Because that's what I've always interpreted his claim, that subjective reports are just data points. So you just assign them, well, someone says this, so we've got to kind of explain why they would say that, and that's basically explaining.
Well, but the heterophenomenology view, it seems to me, is that what we have to explain are the reports.
Right.
I don't think we should explain reports. There is a big difference between the data and the phenomena in philosophy of science. That's Bogan and Woodward. The data, we use it to infer the presence of a certain phenomenon. So I use the subjective report, the report as a data to infer something about the phenomenon I'm interested in, which is consciousness. And so I can perfectly accept the claim that there is nothing subjective in subjective reports, but I can use those reports to study something that is subjective, which is consciousness.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I think I don't know if you're aware of the work of Gualtiero Piccinini. Do you know his work at all? Because he has something I think is kind of similar to this.
Yeah, that's exactly my view. That's the view that subjects are basically detection instruments. You can
yes, exactly.
As detection instruments. Yeah, that's exactly the view that I defend.
Okay, well, that's really interesting. Yeah, it's really nice to see that view develop too, and taken seriously, because I think it's an interesting view. I mean, just again from the devil's advocate side of things, I think someone might accuse you of just simply begging the question right from the start. That if that's the way you study science, it's just by subjective reports, then you've ruled out just from the beginning the possibility of any sort of overflow. Or at least of studying it scientifically. Because someone might say, look, yeah, you can't do, I mean, and in some sense, maybe that's Ned's actual argument, is that you can't scientifically detect this stuff, but there's another way of doing it, the so-called mesh argument, where you try to show that there's this, I don't know, giant swath of evidence in psychology that maps onto some stuff in neuroscience.
It doesn't work. It doesn't. Honestly, the meshing argument doesn't work. So basically they say, well, it's the best explanation of the data. First, anyway, we don't explain data, we explain phenomena, but let's say it's okay to say that we explain the data. It's the best explanation of the data, but they never say, well, what counts as the best explanation? What is it the best explanation? What is your criterion for considering that overflow is the best explanation? And it's really unclear what would count as evidence for overflow, since we cannot detect it in the first place. And so they say, well, we can use some brain patterns in the occipital cortex and say, well, this indicates overflow. But how do you know which brain pattern corresponds to overflowing phenomenal consciousness, and which brain pattern corresponds to unconsciousness? Nobody knows, actually.
It's difficult to say.
They just don't have any criterion for distinguishing between overflowing consciousness and unconsciousness. What's the criterion? If they have a criterion, I can accept that view, I can test it, but right now it's just impossible to test. And so I don't think, I don't see any reason why we should accept that. On the other hand,
oh, sorry, go on the other hand, yeah.
On the other hand, I think there are cases in which we might have reasons to think that subjective reports are not a good way to proceed. For example, I think that the perceptual awareness scale is not a really good scale for a variety of reasons. And I think there are plenty of criticisms that we can make against the view that we should use subjective reports in consciousness science. But really, if you see the actual reasons, not in principle reasons for doubting that we should use subjective reports, aside from in principle arguments, it should be possible that someone could have an overflowing experience. Well, there's not much, I think.
Don't worry, in case anyone cares, there will be someone on soon that actually will defend overflow. So they'll have some. We're not just bashing them. They're it's I kind of feel like we're taking up on a little bit. But I tend to take everything you say very seriously. I'm hearing commotions downstairs of children waking up and so forth and so on. So I can't keep you forever, and I wonder if we could switch for the remaining time to talk about some more contemporary stuff, which is already pretty contemporary, but some of your more nitty-gritty stuff. So like you have a paper talking about prefrontal cortex and what role consciousness plays there with Jorge Morales, and then you have the paper with Hawkman we already mentioned, and then of course there's the paper with 58 authors or whatever, of which I happen to be one 56, small. How many?
56 or 7.
Yeah, it's too many. So you've been doing a lot of not only historical work but contemporary work. So I wonder if you could, first of all, can you say something about this Nature human behavior paper?
Yeah. So basically, it turns out that consciousness science doesn't receive a lot of public funding, especially in the US. And so we wanted to make a kind of call for more funding for consciousness science, as it's important, obviously, for a wide variety of fields. Yeah, so that was basically the idea. And I mean, one of the main problems of consciousness science is that we shouldn't call it consciousness science, but should call it the cognitive neuroscience of consciousness. So that's how I would call it, to distinguish it from what I call consciousness studies. So you have consciousness studies and the cognitive neuroscience of consciousness. Cognitive neuroscience of consciousness is cognitive neuroscience.
Right.
Cognitive neuroscience is about representations, their vehicles in the brain, and computations. Consciousness studies, they don't have these terms.
Right.
How you
they have Deepak Chopra.
They have Deepak Chopra, and maybe even IIT is not a cognitive neuroscientific view of consciousness. It doesn't appeal to representations. It doesn't appeal to vehicles of representations. They appeal to structural patterns in the brain, but they don't care about representations, mental representations. They don't talk about computations. It's not linked to any function in the brain. So IITs in consciousness studies and not cognitive neuroscience of consciousness. Even theories that are more structural in a sense, like the local recurrence theory by Lammer, is really about, it's still a representational theory of consciousness in the sense that the content of consciousness comes from the vehicle, the right dynamics for the vehicle of consciousness, of the representational vehicle.
Right.
So you need the right pattern, but it's still linked somehow to the representations. And so it's still a cognitive neuroscientific theory of consciousness.
And that's that paper you recently shared, by the way, with this unfolding argument, was talking about these structural,
exactly.
the problem with these structural kind of theories. It was very, I mean, I think I nailed one of the major problems with these kinds of
theories. Yeah, exactly. But I think it's, the paper is, I think, entirely right for IIT, but not entirely right for the local recurrence view.
Right, you can't give there's no mathematical formulation of it that you can unfold, really, basically. That's one of the problems.
It's still representational, so it's not so according to IIT, it's really weird. It's the geometry of the pattern of activity.
The MIC.
It's not even neural activity, okay?
Right.
Because the nodes in their model need to be on and off, but neurons are not on and off.
Right.
And so it should be, I don't even know what the nodes are in IIT, but anyway, you have some nodes and you have a kind of geometrical isomorphism relation between qualia space and the structure of these nodes. And so that's what gives the phenomenal character of your experience. But it has nothing to do with representations.
Right. And I mean, this is kind of now on a separate topic. I was at a conference once where Julia was presenting this stuff. And one of the things that he said was, you know, his theory predicts that a brain with no activity at all, with zero activity, no activity, would have conscious experiences as long as none of the connections were damaged. Whereas a brain that with no activity, but there were some, you severed a connection between neuron A and neuron B, then it would not have the conscious experience. And, you know, no one has picked up on that. I thought that was, that's a kind of strikingly bizarre claim that you could have conscious experience with zero brain activity, but just an intact brain. I mean, you might want to test that, I think. That's something we should look into. Because as far as we know, that's like not what we expect over here, you know?
No, but I mean, that's the problem I was talking about. Well, if you bite enough bullets, loads of bullets, your theory of consciousness can go pretty far, right?
Right.
I can have a theory of consciousness on which nobody but me is conscious.
Yeah, exactly.
I can defend that, or if I want to, I can defend it.
Yeah, it's called solipsism.
Neuroscientific solipsism.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, there's an excellent project. How do you do neuroscience on yourself? Aha, solipsism plus subjects. Aha.
That's my subjective data.
Yeah, exactly. I am my own data. Awesome. But just to be somewhat, I mean, not to be fair to IIT, because I agree with the things you're saying, although, you know, as a philosopher, I think I'm more open to some of these weird things that they say, but empirically, I agree with what you're saying. However, to be somewhat fair to them, I wonder if, so would you agree in the best case scenario, like if things went perfect, if everything were magic and rainbows and unicorns all the time, then what you would want to do is like have a theory of consciousness, test it against the data, see if you can falsify it, it doesn't get falsified, see if you can confirm it, see if it explains stuff and stuff. So you get some confidence built up in this theory of consciousness. And then, and only then, you ask questions, okay, what about snails? What about ants? What about non-mammals? What about computers? What about group systems? Like, it seems like at least that part of IIT is on the right track, or at least that's the way they present it. That first they want the theory, and then you tackle the other questions, because you can't really do them without a theory of consciousness. We can't answer the question about dogs before we know, like, theoretically what we're talking about. So that aspect of it is right? Or at least that approach that they have.
Well, not necessarily. Maybe you can have detection procedures that don't rely on a full theory of consciousness.
So you think that we could detect consciousness in snails without understanding what consciousness?
I don't know.
Without having a theory of consciousness.
It's possible, and I don't think we'll have a kind of complete theory of consciousness at one point that it will stop and that will say, well, now we have explained consciousness. I think it will gradually build up, and at some points we'll be able to be a bit more sure about whether snails are conscious. But it's a kind of, we'll probably never be sure, right? Absolutely sure.
Sorry, say that again. Sorry, I was getting a phone call right at that moment for some unknown reason. Sorry, go ahead.
We'll probably never be absolutely sure, but we can have really good reasons to think that it's the case. And we already do. We already have good reasons, for example, to think that birds are conscious, I think, because we can find some neurological, even if they don't have a cortex, we can find some neurological equivalents of the PFC, for example, or stuff like that.
But that's kind of, wouldn't you say that's, I mean, let me put it differently. I would say that's exactly what I was trying to say a second ago, was that it seems like what that kind of argument relies on is, first you have some good reason to think that it's stuff in the PFC maybe that's doing it. Then you find something that's similar to that in the birds. And since you already have a theory that connects consciousness to the PFC, you conclude maybe in birds too.
But
so that is the kind of argument you were writing about.
But my view is that you don't really need a theory. You can just find empirically that consciousness correlates with PFC activity. For example, I don't defend any particular theory of consciousness, but I defend the view that PFC correlates with PFC, consciousness correlates with PFC activity. So I would accept that I don't have a theory. I can look at the bird and say, well, it's probably conscious for this reason. So I don't need a theory.
I guess I was using the word theory. So a theory of consciousness in the sense.
Except if you believe that just a bunch of empirical regularities are already a kind of theory. In that sense, yeah.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. So it's not like you're defending global workspace theory, although I guess you have one paper on that, right? Something about the insula or something. So you're not defending any particular theory. You don't need to be a higher order, global workspace, or whatever to say that the PFC is important for consciousness.
Yeah.
And then if there are things like that in other animals, you have some good reason to think whatever is going on over there too. But still, you need the theory. So what I agree, that's right. But you still need at least the claim that it's PFC and not, medial temporal or subcortical or something else. So you still need that theoretical claim that consciousness is associated with PFC.
Yeah, of course.
And so I know you have recently defended this view, by the way. So I wonder, and I also know, I think historically that you started off kind of doubting that the PFC was important. Maybe it was an artifact or something of the fMRI, right?
Methodological artifact.
Yeah, exactly. So I wonder, first of all, you could tell us like why you changed your mind, and then maybe it's the same thing as saying what you think the current evidence for it is.
Yeah. So, 1 second.
Yeah, exactly. Water break.
So basically you have in consciousness, just 1 moment. My computer, I don't have, I'm out
running out of battery.
Okay. No. All right, yeah. So basically the idea is that you have a lot of evidence in consciousness science in favor of the view that when we contrast conscious and unconscious trials across a wide variety of paradigms, experimental paradigms, and across all sensory modalities that I know of, there is PFC activity in conscious trials and not in unconscious trials. There is occipital cortex activity in both unconscious trials and conscious trials. And so you have experiments with visual masking, for example, Lowe and Passingham in 2006. You have experiments in the auditory modality with Sadagiani and colleagues in 2009. You have all this stuff shows that the PFC is important for consciousness. It's a correlate of consciousness. And now you have different ways of interpreting this. And a lot of people don't really believe that the PFC is a correlate of consciousness. And there are two main arguments. The first main argument is that lesions to the prefrontal cortex don't obliterate consciousness. And so you have several papers making that point. You have a paper by Pollen in 2011. You have a more recent paper by Melanie Bolly in 2017, I guess. And in philosophy, there is a paper by Benji Kozuk in 2014.
Right.
And so all these people make this argument, but this argument has been kind of debunked by Brian Odegaard, I think. And I think the evidence they cite is not really convincing. So let's put this argument aside.
Yeah.
And so the more interesting argument, on my view, is what we call the argument from report. And so that's a paper that I wrote with Jorge. And that's basically an idea that is present pretty much everywhere now, I guess. The idea that the PFC activity during conscious trials is due to the fact that people have to report being conscious and not due to the fact that people are conscious.
Right.
And so you find this everywhere in Tsukiya and colleagues in 2015, or Kaur and colleagues, people who defend IIT.
Yeah, exactly.
But the most interesting researcher who's defending this claim, I think, is Michael Pitts. And his work is great. So I tend to think he's the best proponent of that view.
Yeah.
I myself defended that view 2 years ago, I think. I wrote a paper that was called Methodological Artifacts in Consciousness Science. And so the argument from report basically is the following. If you want to detect consciousness, you need people to report. But then if some brain area lights up, you don't know whether it's due to the report or due to consciousness. And it's really difficult to know. And so it could be both. So my counter argument is probably the simplest counter argument that I've ever found.
Cool.
I was really surprised that nobody talks about that, because it's pretty obvious. And the counter argument is this. People have to report on both conscious and unconscious trials.
Exactly.
So if PFC activity is really due to the report, we should find it on conscious and unconscious trials, but we find it only on conscious trials, and so the PFC activity is not linked to the report. So that's basically the counter argument that we give. But of course, it's not so easy. I think it's just this one simple argument forces people to make the debate a bit more complex, so it's already good. But as I said, Michael Pitts, for example, they will say, well, of course, people have to report in both the conscious and unconscious condition. And so what they'll say is that there's still a difference, and the difference is this. When you see the stimulus consciously, you maintain information about the stimulus in working memory, and when you see it unconsciously, there is nothing to maintain in working memory. And so what explains the difference is not the report, but the fact that you maintain information in working memory for the report. And so in the paper with Jorge, we have counter-arguments to this view. The first counter-argument is that it's just false that in the unconscious condition, there is nothing to maintain. There are experiments showing that, for example, the experiment by Jean-Rémy King in 2016, or Salty and colleagues in 2015, they show that you can decode, for example, Salty, they show that you can decode unconscious contents from the prefrontal cortex, even when people say, well, I didn't see the stuff. So it's false that nothing is maintained in the brain in unconscious trials. So that's
and the recording of the stuff from the prefrontal cortex is not with fMRI, is it? You have to use ECOG or something that's more invasive to be able to decode those unconscious.
In Salty and colleagues, 2015, it's fMRI, but I'm not sure.
Interesting.
There are other studies with ECOG anyway.
Okay.
And so that's the first argument. But still, they find that there are still differences in the PFC, in the conscious and unconscious conditions. Even on conscious correct trials and unconscious correct trials. So the information, the first order information is used exactly in the same way. They press the same button, they do exactly the same thing. The only difference is they say, I'm conscious or I'm not conscious. And here you see differences in prefrontal cortex. So the second argument that we presented was, I think it was based on a study by Lafuente and Romo. So that's a really fascinating study. And so in this study, monkeys were presented with stimuli, and they recorded, so it was tactile stimuli. And so they recorded in the PFC. I don't remember exactly where in the PFC. And what they showed is that when the monkeys detected...
Monkeys are people too.
When monkey people detected the stimuli, the tactile stimulus, they had differences in PFC activity, but not when they didn't. But here too, you can have the report argument. It's because the monkeys actually reporting. But what they did was something really clever. At the beginning of in a control condition, at the beginning of every trial, the correct response button was illuminated. And so before the stimulus was presented, the monkey already knew the right decision, and it already maintained in working memory what it would have to do. He will have to do. And so the decision was already made. And basically, there was no difference in PFC activity between the control condition and the other experimental condition. So what it shows is that even when the monkey already took the decision before the stimulus is presented, the PFC activity that they recorded remained the same. And so it shows that PFC activity is not due to the fact that they maintain a decision, oh, I saw the stimulus, and then say, I saw the stimulus. It's really due to the fact that the neurons fire when the stimulus is presented. And so that's another aspect of things. There is a study by Merton and Nieder in 2012 in which they show that basically in the PFC you have two kinds, they find two kinds of neurons, the yes and no neurons. And so yes for yes, I've seen the stimulus, and no, I didn't see the stimulus. Some neurons are specialized for these two categories. And what they find, interestingly, is that those neurons fire during the report, yes and no. But yes neurons, only yes neurons fire during the stimulus presentation. Okay? So when the stimulus presentation is presented, the yes neurons fire. And so it shows that in some sense, it's not just categorization. There's something more than just categorizing, because otherwise, when no stimulus is presented, you would see the no neurons activated during the presentation of nothing. So that was basically the arguments that we had. And so obviously, people will say, well, but what do you do with all those great no-report paradigms in which we show that there is no prefrontal cortex activity, and we answer that it's just a type 2 error.
Yeah.
They reject the null hypothesis, when in fact they shouldn't. And also they don't have any statistical evidence that they should reject the null hypothesis. It's just a statistical basic point, a basic statistical mistake in a sense, because they show that they have p-values above 0.5, but 0.05, but it doesn't protect you against type 2 errors. It
Right.
protects you against type 1 errors. And so basically we say it's all type 2 errors. Even in some, and we also brings a lot of evidence, I think, good evidence, showing that when you have more sensitive measures, even when you have no report,
Yeah.
there's still activity in the PFC on conscious trials only. And so I think basically we don't have really good reasons for believing that PFC activity is linked either to, in consciousness science, is linked either to maintenance in working memory, or to report, or to the decision to report, or even to relevance. There is a study by Martin and colleagues in 2013 in which they can decode irrelevant, task-irrelevant, non-reported stimuli in the PFC.
Yeah.
I mean, there's really a lot of evidence in favor of prefrontal cortex, and I don't think people, I do think that people have kind of overestimated the value of those no-report paradigms experiments. Yeah.
They definitely have. I mean, as you know, Hawk once pointed this out for a long time, that they've been doing them for a while. And, you know,
Yeah.
the other thing that I think is also important is that fMRI is a fairly weak tool. And so if all you're showing is that there's diminished activity, that's not exactly that surprising. It's not the same as showing that there's none. The type 2 error thing, I think, is really important. You know, it was funny in the old days, Steve Fleming and Hawkwan and I used to play music together, and we had this group we called the William James Trio, which, you know, whatever it was fun for us, at least. To do it, I don't know if it's fun for everyone else, but originally we were going to call it type 2. And we were worried that people might think we were talking about diabetes or something, so we switched it. But yeah, we were like, yeah, this type 2 error stuff is important stuff, man. So
and you have a lot of papers showing that, especially in neuroimaging, you have really good reasons for thinking that there are a lot of type 2 errors. Because usually scientists, they protect themselves against type 1 errors with p-values, obviously is important.
Right.
But I think that neuroimaging is vastly underpowered.
Yeah.
And so basically a null result, it doesn't mean anything. It really doesn't mean anything. It means something a little bit, but
yeah,
it doesn't really reinforce the probability of the null hypothesis being false.
The amount of like misunderstanding in general of what you can and can't get from fMRI is pretty bad. I mean, I know as someone who has to teach neuroscience to undergraduates that it's like the misunderstandings are deeply entrenched in the common conception of these things. It's hard to get rid of them, actually.
And even with fMRI, you have no report studies showing PFC activity. For example, in binocular rivalry, you have a study by Wilker in 2009 in which they show PFC activity during passive viewing.
Right.
And with more sensitive measures like single cell recording, you have a study by, I can't say his name, Panagiotaropoulos,
Yeah.
In 2012, in which they show that during binocular rivalry, you have also PFC activity when the switch occurs.
Right. Yeah, and that's another area where there's no report paradigms getting overblown, where people are trying to link the pupil response to consciously experiencing one versus the other. It's these other kinds of methods looking at PFC activity, I think, are should be paid more attention to. So
yeah.
I think that your work on this area is, as usual, really good and also important. People should be thinking about these issues.
Yeah,
and the level of discussion about consciousness in the science needs to go up another level or so, right? We're at the point now where it's time to really get serious from a philosophy of science point of view about these questions.
I just think people should. I mean, one thing that I don't like is what I call abstract philosophers. So these are philosophers that read the abstracts of scientific articles. And
right.
oh, this is a really good. This could constitute very good data against some philosophical view. I really think that the most important thing is to try to understand the experimental paradigms correctly, and we will probably avoid a lot of mistakes and annoying scientists with philosophical issues that are not really scientific.
Yeah. I mean, a methods issue, it's you can get a PhD in philosophy and you have to have some kind of formal methods, but there's no empirical methods requirement. Unless you do interdisciplinary work, right? There's no lab work required for a PhD in philosophy, which is unfortunate. If you want to talk about these issues, I think that stuff's important to see.
Just understanding type 1, type 2 mistakes, errors.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to be fair to philosophers, it's not always the case that even scientists are good at it.
Yeah,
so it's not just philosophers who need stats. it's everybody, because you know what, people suck at stats. All right, let's just face it.
I know I do.
Yeah.
I'm really bad.
But in this case, it's really important. And I think we agree on this, that the point that we're at right now is very pivotal with respect to, the science of consciousness has been around for a long time. But the moment where we are now is kind of an interesting moment, because the neuroscience, the cognitive neuroscience of consciousness is fighting to establish itself as a serious endeavor. And there are at the same time forces amassed against it, trying to drag it into, a less
studies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in a sense, that's true. And there is this kind of tug of war going on between these two camps. And of course, what people don't really realize unless they do the work in this area is that the one serious aspect of it, the neuroscience that we like, depends on a lot of money. And if that money's not coming in, then that's going to die, because that's the way the system currently is set up. It's not ideal, and I don't like it. Personally, my philosophy of grant funding should be just like give everyone money and let them do it, and then like just shut up about it. But that's not usually the way it works. So that's why this is so important, because we're fighting as a group, I think, to be not just taken seriously, but for the legacy of this to be taken seriously, for this to be a serious thing.
I think it's a matter of perception. Perception really matters here.
Yeah.
Because, look, when people who are at the NIH were really, really serious scientists who have worked on, I don't know, synaptic transmission and really sciencey topics, they look at some consciousness science stuff. They learn about it in the journals, and they see, well, neuroscientists now believe that spoons could be conscious and rocks could be conscious and stuff like that. It's a new scientific consensus. It's scientific. They rightly believe that consciousness science should not receive funding. I mean, if I were them and I had only this information, I would not give funding to consciousness science.
Right.
Of course, if in the media and...
I mean, that's not what panpsychists believe, but I understand the point.
Yeah, of course. If in the media, at least it's how it's
portrayed. Yeah.
And that's why perception...
I mean, no respectable person thinks a spoon is conscious. They think electrons are conscious, okay?
Who would be crazy enough to believe that spoons are conscious?
Exactly. It's clearly electrons, obviously. That's way less crazy.
Yeah, much less. Yeah.
But obviously that you're making an important point. I'm joking. In case people don't know, I'm kind of sick, and the kids have been sick and haven't been sleeping. So if I'm a little bit flippant, that's because let's blame that. But we're making a serious point here about perception amongst so-called serious scientists about the field, and it's more than just like we want to be considered cool. It's that those persons decide whether or not we get to keep doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
That's the issue, and that brings us back to you mentioned the NIH. I mean, it's this this moonshot proposal. I don't know how much actually we can or want to talk about that right now, but I mean it's kind of an interesting development which has happened, which is that there's this weaseling into of those areas by by the kind of things we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a real problem when some not pseudoscientific, but claims that are unsupported by the data kind of start shaping the field.
Yeah.
I think it's a real problem, especially if it's going to determine the amount of funding that others in the field are going to receive. I think that's a real problem.
I mean, philosophers, we can talk about any kind of crazy stuff we want because they'll pay us either way. But if you're a scientist, they won't pay you unless you give the funding to do this thing.
Really important. I think philosophers don't realize that nearly enough.
Right.
In science, if you start writing in your grant proposal that you're going to investigate consciousness in, I don't know, electrons, not spoons, but or logic gates, you have, I mean, the chances are pretty good that you won't get enough money to do anything.
But that's not what they do. What they're doing is like saying we want to tell the difference between someone in a coma and not, and someone who's locked in syndrome or not. So that's the way they spin it.
They get funding from private foundations, so from the Core brothers. So they. I think,
you're talking about the tiny blue dot, the Koch.
Yeah, the tiny blue dot foundation is funded. So basically, the integrated information theory receives funding from the Tiny Blue Dot Foundation, which is directed by Elizabeth Core, which is the daughter of one of the Core brothers. I think it's Charles Core.
It's one of, I don't know, but yeah. Well, we got to get George Soros over here to fund.
Great, you know.
Exactly. We'll take on the Koch brothers. Come on, Soros, give us money.
Anyway, I think that's in a domain in which what consciousness scientists are doing is really important for a lot of ethical issues, for consciousness in fetuses, for consciousness in patients who cannot communicate, and so on and so on. I think the last thing you want to do is to explore a lot of possibilities and say that all those possibilities are equally serious.
Right.
Sometimes, as James put it, sometimes the best thing to do is to avoid mistakes and not find truth. When the stakes are high, your first goal is not to find truth. Your first goal is to avoid saying a lot of nonsense, because if you say a lot of nonsense, it might have potentially disastrous consequences.
Right.
So your first goal is to avoid making too many mistakes, not to find the theory. That should be the first goal, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's incredibly important. Right.
A lot of mistakes. And that's a really important distinction. When there are ethical issues and so on, go for not making a lot of mistakes. If there are if you don't really care about making mistakes, it's okay to explore a lot of possibilities, I think.
Now, I know I can't keep you forever. We've already been talking for too long. We haven't even got to talk about fish at all, which I was hoping we could talk about fish and some of these same issues, because, I mean, really briefly, I really like your take on the multiple realizability argument, and I think it's another example of where there may be some underdetermination. But really, the part that, I mean, so I think that connects to what we've already been saying, but the part that I really like there is the idea that there just isn't any empirical evidence for multiple realization. It's a lot of it is taken on faith by the proponents of it, that it just seems like it's got to be that way. But when you ask for actual examples of it, they're really not that convincing, actually.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of fish pain, I think it's even worse than that. I think it's really, really difficult to bring actual evidence of multiple realization of pain. And so basically the argument that I give is the argument of Polger and Shapiro in their last book,
Right.
The multiple realization book, I think.
Right. Yeah, that's it.
And that's a great book. I liked it. And so basically they argue, well, people talk about multiple realizability. If you're a kind of empiricist, you would like some actual examples of multiple realization.
Right.
Before we can talk about multiple realizability, if I told you that eyes are multiply realizable, but I cannot bring a single example of a multiply realized eye, you wouldn't believe me when I say it's multiply realizable. In the case of multiple realizability of mental states, it's the same thing. And so a lot of people say that, well, all right, you know, in order to have pain in humans, you need to have a cortex. Not all people agree with that, but let's say it's true.
Yes, right-thinking people agree with it.
In order to have pain in humans, you need to have a cortex. And since fish don't have cortices, they don't have a cortex, they are not conscious. And so they don't feel pain.
Right. That's the no cortex, no cry.
Yeah, no cortex, no cry.
Which, by the way, they still do cry. They just don't maybe.
Yeah. They don't feel themselves crying.
Yeah.
If they don't have a cortex, they have nociception, so they can react to noxious stimuli that damage their body in a variety of ways, but they don't feel pain. And so a lot of people react to this argument by saying, well, of course they feel pain, because just like feathers are necessary for birds to fly, if you take a bat, for example, bats don't have feathers, but they can still fly. And you can, by analogy, say a cortex is necessary for pain in humans. Fish don't have a cortex, but they can still feel pain. And why do we know that they can still feel pain? It's because they have pain-like behaviors. They behave in ways that indicate that they feel pain. But once you accept that, the problem is that you have a kind of slippery slope. At what point do you reject the view that something that feels that exhibits pain-like behaviors actually feel pain? At one point, do you say, well, a frog's spinal cord cannot realize pain? You have to find some criterion between implausible and plausible multiple realizations of pain.
Right.
That I claim they cannot do. Why? Because to find a criterion, for example, your criterion could be, well, everything that has pain-like behaviors feels pain, except if they don't have a brain, for example. Well, but how do you know?
Yeah.
Why this criterion instead of except if they don't have a cortex? Then you have to bring some evidence.
Right.
Criterion, except if they don't have a cortex, I have evidence. Humans, when they don't have a cortex, they don't feel pain. That's evidence for my criterion. Why do you take the criterion that corresponds to your pre-theoretical ideas of what's conscious and what's not? And so they have to find a criterion. The problem is that to find such criterion, they need to test hypotheses of the kind for all entities that have X, they can feel pain, and without X, they cannot feel pain. The problem is that if you want to test this hypothesis, this criterion, then you need to know whether or not entities in which you test the criterion feel pain or not.
Exactly.
You don't learn anything from the test. But you have to presuppose that they feel pain in order to test the claim that having a brain is necessary for feeling pain. And so it's a kind of, they are forced to enter into a kind of circular, a vicious circle in which they can never provide a criterion for distinguishing plausible cases of multiple realization from implausible cases. So that's the argument. And you can push this argument further into saying that, in fact, they cannot even provide us with good reasons for believing in multiple realization in the first place. Why? Because it's the same thing. If they want to prove that pain is multiple realizable, they have to show that some animal feels pain, but how do they know? Basically, the argument is that to interpret the data, you need to have decided whether pain is multiply realized or not. So you cannot bring any evidence in favor of the multiple realization of pain. That's the idea.
I like that argument, that it presupposes, in order to find evidence, you have to presuppose it. And if you don't presuppose it, then you won't find evidence for it. Yeah. So I like the structure of that argument. I wonder how come your own view about birds isn't putting some pressure on that. So you think birds are conscious, you have evidence for that. So is that not evidence for a kind of multiple realizability of multiple realization of pain?
So it depends on how you define multiple realization, and that's where it gets a bit tricky.
Right.
Multiple realization typically is not understood as realizing the same. So first, most of the time it's realizing a function. Here it's realizing a phenomenal character.
Right.
Okay? Which is already weird, by the way.
Yes.
Anyway, let's say that phenomenal characters can be multiply realized, whatever that means. It's not about the stuff that composes the realizer. It's about the way in which it's organized, I think. So, for example, if my pen was, instead of being made of wood, it's wood.
Oh.
It was iron or anything else, it wouldn't count as multiple realization. Why? Because it's not the same stuff, but it just writes in the same way. Okay? So to have multiple realization, you need to realize the same kind in different ways, not just with different stuff. Here in birds, basically the idea is that they realize this. Probably, I'm not sure. I would say it's 70% chances that they are conscious, but they probably realize pain in a way that is, in fact, actually pretty similar to the way in which we realize pain, even if it's without a cortex. So it's not just the idea that it's there is not something really intrinsically special with the cortex.
Right.
In the way in which the neurons.
It's what it does.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you push that far enough, then it seems like you could say that, you could have consciousness in an artificial system and yet not multiple realization. So if you have like a robot that's conscious, but doing it in the way that it's done in our whatever, then it doesn't matter if it's silicon or biological on your view.
Yeah, maybe, or I would say that, for example, if it's in silicon chips, but if it still performs the same computations, it's not really multiple realization, because it's just some different stuff realizing the same function, but in the same way. it's still realizing the same function in the same way.
So does Ned's example of the China brain, is that the same way? If you have 100 billion people all doing the functions of neurons?
Good case, yeah. I don't know. Maybe that would be in the same way. Yeah, they would, if they realize the exact same computations.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting view. I don't know if that's like the standard way of thinking about multiple realization.
Well, I think that's how Polger and Shapiro think about it. My way of thinking about it is a bit stronger, I think.
Yeah.
I think you need a lot of evidence, actually, for really thinking that something is really multiply realized. Because otherwise, everything is multiply realizable. That's really true. You just have to show that you can do it with one little difference somewhere, and it's multiply realizable.
Yeah, exactly. One electron in this carbon atom is different, and is that multiple realization? Well, it doesn't seem like it should be.
You need something that really differentiates. But in fish, the problem is that we don't find yet, we haven't found yet the kind of analogs to the cortex in humans. And so that's why the case of fish is different from birds.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. So, although it depends on the kind of fish, right? I mean, some fish, I think, like maybe trout or something like that, have something like a primitive cortex. So it really just depends on the species.
It depends on the kind of fish. For example, but most people talk about teleostei fish.
Yeah.
Have a cortex. And in cartilaginous fish like rays and sharks, they don't, I mean, scientists didn't even find nociceptors.
Right. That's an interesting point. So they still have pain behavior, though.
I'm not there are some reports showing that sometimes a shark can be cut in two halves and continue eating.
He's hungry.
If I'm really hungry, I would do the same.
Yeah, exactly. No, but that's pretty. Yeah, it's pretty. So they don't have the pain behavior. So I thought they did have some avoidance behavior and even some.
Maybe, but I guess it's mostly it's not really studied.
Yeah, right.
We just need to have more data to decide. But basically, my argument is not against consciousness in fish. I personally don't think that fish are conscious. But for my real view is that we don't know.
Right.
And if you claim that you know that fish are conscious and that they multiply realize pain, you go beyond the available data, and it's not intellectually honest.
Yeah, no, in that part I agree. See, I'm on the other side of it, but at the same place. So I personally think fish are conscious, but I also think we don't know it, and it hasn't been established. So for the same reasons that we've been discussing, and this is something that it's just so hard for the average person. Like I press this case all the time in class. Animals conscious, yes or no? Yes, obviously they cry when you kick them. Yeah, but can you build something that cries when you kick it but doesn't feel pain? Yes, obviously you can. But then why over here? What are we not getting? There just is a real disconnect. Ultimately, it comes down to people have this kind of impression that it's alive, and therefore it feels something when it acts that way. But things that aren't alive, then of course you say, what about Roomba? Is Roomba alive? I think, yeah, why not? It doesn't reproduce, but neither does other. Anyway, so you can get the whole can of worms opens up. But in the popular mind, there's just this link between it acts that way, so we must. And what reason will we have for not?
I think we think this way, and it's normal to think that way, but
it's not scientific to think that way.
I don't think people realize the importance, and it's true also even for scientists working in consciousness science. They don't realize how huge blind sight is, and how huge all the studies on the fact that people can retain procedural memory without conscious memories. All this stuff that shows big dissociations between conscious and unconscious processing, and show that you can have a lot of unconscious processing and complex behaviors with unconscious processing. People underestimate that, I think. And so they underestimate what you can do with unconscious processes.
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
yes.
that's why they believe that, oh, surely if you have this behavior, you should have consciousness. But do you accept that for the frog's spinal cord? No, surely not. I mean,
yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a point that we tried to, when I wrote the paper with Joe Ledoux, we tried to make this point. So if the options are not either the consciousness or they're just mechanisms that can't respond flexibly to the environment, there's this in-between position, which is that they're cognitively sophisticated at an unconscious level, and that explains what they're doing, but not, there's no need to postulate the extra addition of consciousness. It is interesting that you see this kind of difference between people working in animals and people working in humans. So in animals, the claim is, how do you demonstrate the animal is conscious? Whereas in humans, the claim is, how do you demonstrate that they're unconscious processing? And they're you know, similar debates, but in opposite directions.
Well, I mean, it depends on which animals we're talking about, right?
Right.
If in monkeys, obviously. In mammals, in general, it will be pretty much like humans, I guess. I hope.
Well, it depends, because you know, you might think there's a difference between verbal reports on the one hand and nonverbal reports.
Yeah.
So while monkeys can report, they can't verbally report yet, anyway. But and there are some interesting studies that show that you get different results depending on whether someone verbally reports or finger presses or indicates with an eye movement.
By Marcel.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there are issues here. And I'm optimistic about overcoming them, but I do think that there are real methodological issues, specifically related to, can we use nonverbal reports as being reliable indicators or traces of consciousness or whatever? And I think that we can get to the point where the answer is yes. I know other people, I know like Joe is more skeptical of that. Joe Ledoux, he's much more skeptical that you could ever get to the point where we would have any good reason to trust nonverbal reports over verbal reports. So that's a more of an old school kind of, you know, I guess Joe's famous quote, I guess it's famous now, since I don't know, but his quote now is, you know, when it comes to behavior, he's a behaviorist. When it comes to consciousness, he's a consciousness guy. But if pushing buttons is just basically a kind of behavior, you don't need to postulate conscious experience to explain why the animal's pushing this button versus that button, for the same reasons we've all been discussing this entire time. So it does look like, you know, anytime the animal pushes it and you take that as indicating it was consciously aware, you have the same issue. Why take that as evidence as opposed to it being done unconsciously?
The thing is that, once again, you use the metaphor of the verbal report, but it's almost never a verbal report. In consciousness science, people press buttons for both the first order and second order tasks. So it's pressing buttons all the way down, right? It's just
exactly.
It's just behaviors.
Yeah, but there's a difference, because you know that the person's pressing the button because they understand that pressing it means that they saw it. Whereas you can't rule out that the monkey's pressing the button because it associates reward with button pressing.
Oh, but you can develop also some ways of testing consciousness in monkeys too. I mean, for example, it's quite ironic because the first cases of blind sight were in monkeys.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
but it was, I mean,
and so it's precisely by using the same methods we used in monkeys in humans that we discovered that humans too could have blind sight behaviors. Before that,
but if before the humans cases, no one would have been very confident in saying the monkeys didn't have conscious experience, but were performing the task anyway. That would seem pretty counterintuitive, I would think, right? They had to test that in humans where they could actually say no, I'm not seeing it. Actually, I don't see it. It's not there for me. And then we go, okay, so monkeys too. But that's where the verbal report comes in, right? So
I think there are some articles by Humphrey, early articles on blind sight, in which he says that it's I may misquote here, but approximately he says it's as if the monkey didn't believe that she could see.
Right. But it's the as if part that's important, and that's where the humans that to sort of get to a place where you would feel comfortable making that claim, you would have to do human work first, where you could verify with a verbal report as opposed to just a behavioral response.
Yeah.
So that's where I was. So ultimately, that's what I think the verbal report trumps, or at least that's part of the case for why verbal report would trump these other nonverbal ways of indicating, including confidence measures and all that other stuff. So.
But it depends on the cases.
Yeah, it depends on the cases. Yeah,
that's some cases
that's absolutely okay.
So self-evident that you can use direct responses, first order, that you can use that to detect consciousness.
Right.
Most of the time, that's what we do, right? We see people do stuff, and we infer that they are conscious of things in their environment. We don't ask them all the time.
Right. But that is, I think, one of the, I mean, so I think that's one of the big problems here. So to descend into theoretical talk for a second. So for someone like me who's interested in debates between first order theories, higher order theories in general, and support, one of them, but not ultimately. But anyway, so as someone interested in that debate and what would count as evidence for or against a first order theory or a higher order theory, these kinds of questions are going to matter more, right? So if you take one, well, actually, yeah, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought. What were you just saying a second ago? Yeah, you lost it too. I got a text from my wife downstairs saying you've been up for a long time and we're going to eat lunch now.
All right.
That derailed me a little bit, but obviously I can. Sorry about that. Yeah, we've been going for a long time now, and I'm going to have to. Is there anything that hasn't come up that you would like to have come up before we call it a day?
I think that's fine. That's fine. That's okay.
I want to thank you for your time. I really do think that your work is excellent. I can't really believe that you've done all this amazing work before you even have defended your PhD. So we expect great things from you, obviously, and really appreciate you taking the time and discussing this stuff.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Bye. Okay. Stay on for a second. I'll say bye. Line.